It's my pleasure sorry, to move to the next talk with Marc Allassonnière-Tang, who is a researcher in the Musée d'Histoire Naturelle de Paris. So it's the French National Museum for the history, for natural history, and he belongs to the CNRS as a member of the eco-anthropology lab, investigating diversity in language using computational linguistic approaches and many different on many different topics, but in particular, for our concern today, is focusing on the sociocultural and linguistics aspect of gender of nouns we use, of the language we use, and gender in our sociocultural practices. So he will be exploring how diversity in this domain actually interact between the sociocultural aspect and the linguistic aspect, which is a topic of hot and very heated debate in France in particular, because, you know, we have this écriture inclusive debate in France, where people struggle quite a lot on whether we should spell noun in a specific fashion, and some people have very strong anti-reaction to that. So it's very interesting to have this also linguistic perspective added to our psychological perspective that Amy just gave us. So please welcome on stage Marc Allassonnière-Tang.
Hi, everybody. So we talked about social media interaction, and that usually involves the use of language, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. And I always like to start presentation by interacting with people, so that's what I'm going to do. So please bear with me with this little game that I have here. So on the screen you see 5 elements. You have assigned men, assigned women, and 2, let's say, a snake, scorpions, and I always forgot the name of that. How do you say ortie in English again?
I don't know.
It's a plant that stings when you walk in it. I always forget the name. But basically, I'm going to ask a few people that volunteer, if they like to put them into categories. So, for example, you could put humans into one, everything else in the other, or do other way around. You can have 2 categories, 3, 4, 5, as many as you want. Do we have any volunteer to do that? Yeah, perfect, thanks.
So the humans go in one category and the non-humans go into the other.
Okay, so basically, these 2 together and everything else together.
Yeah.
Perfect, thanks. I'm going to ask 2 more volunteers if there are people in the room. Yeah, thanks.
Pictures go in one category and photography in another one.
Perfect. So these 2 basically together and these 3, right? Thanks. One more person. Thanks.
Animals in one category and plants in another.
Okay, so basically these 4 together and this one. Thanks. So I could ask a lot more about this, and we might find a lot more categories, but the idea here is to show that we tend to categorize the element around us in different ways, including experience as well, and that can be reflected in language as well. So if you take, for example, Spanish, you have a grammatical system or grammatical structure that puts everything in either masculine or feminine, a bit like what French is doing. But if you go to different languages worldwide, you're going to find a lot of diversity there. So, for example, a Caribbean language, Hiscaliana, you will have animate, inanimate distinction. So here you will have these 4 elements in one and plant in the other, exactly as one of the categorization that we have. If we travel to around India, where we have a Dravidian language, Kannada, then we have 3 categories. We have a male human, female human, a neuter that includes the other 3 elements. If we go in Zande, an Atlantic Congo language, we have 4 categories where we have a male human, female human, animates and inanimates. If you go to Yazguliam, an Indo-European language, you have male and everything. So you have female and animals and male plus everything else. So you have a lot of different ways to categorize it. And finally, if you go to a Pama-Nyungan language in Australia, the herbal, you will have 4 categories. So you have male human animates, female human birds, water and fire related nouns, stinging things, edible inanimates and everything else. And so this, for example, for this language, it was documented, and it gave a book that I think the title is horribly politically incorrect nowadays, which was Woman, Fire and Dangerous Things, because the author kind of thought that in this category you have a grammatical gender category that regroups elements like this. So the idea here, of course, is just to show that there is a lot of diversity in the way we do things, how we categorize things, among others, and it's reflected in language, and that's kind of what I'm interested in. So why? Because there are more than 7,000 languages worldwide. So here you have a map from Glottolog where one point represents a language, and you kind of see that there are a lot of languages everywhere. And what I'm interested in is to document and study the diversity that we find in these languages, more specifically in how language categorizes nouns. So basically the term nominal classification. There are two main types of systems that you find. There are many more, but in general two. So the first one is a grammatical gender, also called noun classes, where you find, for example, in French, in Spanish, or for example, in Romance languages, or in German, you have masculine, feminine, neuter, for example. The idea here is that nouns are affiliated to different categories, and these categories are reflected by grammatical agreement in the sentence. So, for example, if table is feminine, then you are going to have a feminine agreement on the adjective, on the articles, sometimes on the verbs, etc. Categories can, so in French, for example, or in Spanish, you have masculine, feminine. In German, you have masculine, feminine, neuter. In other languages, you might have the same type of structure, but it's, the categories are based on humanness, or based on animacy, or based on plants, etc. The other main type of system that you find is called classifiers. So here the idea is that you have no grammatical agreement, so you don't have this, these markers that spread around in the sentence, but you have a word or a morpheme that highlights a semantic trait of a semantic feature of the referent. So, for example, if I take Mandarin Chinese, you don't have grammatical agreement, as in the example above. However, you have a classifier for vehicles, for example. You can have, to give you an idea of diversity, you can have classifiers for round objects, long objects, things that have a handle. It can be for a lot of the functions as well, etc., etc. So you have these main types of systems if you want to have an idea of how they are found worldwide. So in blue, you have languages that use masculine, feminine, that use categories that involve masculine, feminine distinction. In green, you have languages that have a system that is like French, where you have grammatical agreement, but the system does not involve the masculine, feminine distinction. So, for example, it involves distinction based on humans, plants, etc. And in red, you have languages that use classifier systems, so like Mandarin Chinese, Japanese, etc. So this is a sample of 3,000 languages worldwide, so it's kind of half of the existing languages, but it gives a general overview of the diversity of the systems. So after finding them, what I'm doing with colleagues as well is to look at the interaction, so between language, the cognitive system, and the environment. The environment can be cultural or can be natural. To give you, I'm going to give some examples. So if you take the natural environment as an example, let's say if a language is spoken in an area where you have a lot of plants, are you more likely to have categories based on plants, for example? If you look at the cultural environment, I have a short example here. So again, here it's more a qualitative example, let's put it this way, but it kind of gives the idea of where we would like to go with this. So in this paper, the idea was to compare two language communities. So you have Hindi speaking community and Pnar. Pnar is an Austroasiatic language. Both of them have a masculine, feminine grammatical gender distinction, but they have some cultural differences. For example, Hindi has more patrilinear system, while Pnar has a matrilinear system. And interestingly, we kind of have a mirror image when we compare the two languages. So in Hindi, for example, we find that, for example, if a bag is masculine, you can, if you change it to feminine, like you change the marker A to E, you can make it smaller. So it kind of works a little bit in the French way when you add e, like livre, livret, voiture, voiturette, or camion, camionnette. I think that's a better example. But here you have a change of grammatical gender of the noun, which involves a difference of big and small. And if new words are borrowed from other languages into the language, it tends, of course, not always, but it tends to be masculine. For example, the word council has been borrowed from another language and is masculine. If you go to Pnar, you have really a mirror image here where For example, a basket is feminine. If you want to change it to small, you change it to masculine instead. And you have different nouns where you can use this. So it's not like an isolated case, only the word basket can apply this change. And new words that are borrowed in the language tend to be feminine. So for exactly the same word that we have above, it is feminine in Pnar, but masculine in Hindi. Of course, the idea is not to say that with this evidence we can show a direct correlation between them, but it was more like a qualitative example to say, oh, okay, maybe there is something there, and it would be interesting to go and see how language and culture could interact in different ways. So basically, when you look at how language classifies nouns, there are different types of diversity you can look at. One is a diversity of systems. So here you have an example of a sample of Atlantic languages spoken mostly in Africa. So the idea here is one tip is a language, and you have a phylogenetic tree, so that shows a relatedness between different languages. And what we were interested in looking at is, so in these languages we have noun class systems, so that work like French but are not based on masculine, feminine distinction. And we were interested in documenting, for example, first, are these categories marked on the articles, the demonstratives, the adjectives, cardinal numerals, pronouns, verbs, and prefixes? And are they marked as prefix or suffixes? So blue means not marked, orange means marked. And the idea was to use phylogenetic methods to look at how the marking spreads. So do you get it first marked on the, let's say, the verb, and then it goes to the pronouns, or is it the other way around, etc. So one thing is to look at how these systems are diverse. We can also look at the diversity of the assignment. So generally speaking, when we look at languages like French or Spanish that have a grammatical gender, people tend to say, well, table, let's say in French, is feminine, and that's it. It doesn't change, doesn't vary. Everybody agrees on that. If you go to do some digging into data, for example, in dialects spoken in France, you do see quite a lot of variety there. So, for example, here you have a map showing the gender of the word poison in different dialects of French. So if it's green, it's masculine, and if it's yellow, it's feminine. So in standard French, poison is masculine, but here you do see that even in France, where people expect that there were not much variation, you actually see a lot. So it means that there is a lot of things where we could go deeper to see what's going on there, and how, for example, and to answer this mythical question that everybody asks when they are learning French, why is table feminine, why is this masculine, etc., etc. So that's what we're doing. In terms of methods, so I'm going to give 2 short examples of what methods I generally use with some colleagues as well. So one is to use, to borrow phylogenetic methods and to see how language evolve across time. So we have, for example, phylogenetic trees of languages, and the idea is to see, to reconstruct, for example, first what is the status of grammatical gender system or nominal classification system at the root. Did these languages have these systems long ago, or did it happen, did they occur at a specific branches at a specific time? And how do they change across time? So in this paper, the idea was to look at the interaction between the complexity of grammatical gender system. So one example was the interaction between agreement patterns and rules. So long story short, in grammatical gender systems, you have categories. So you can have masculine, feminine, neuter, human, plant, etc. And you have places where these categories are marked. So as in the previous example, are they on the adjective, are they on the pronouns, are they on the verbs, etc. And there were 2 different hypotheses in linguistics. So one saying that there is a trade-off of complexity. So if you have a lot of categories, you are not going to mark it a lot because that's very costly. That's a lot of cost. The other hypothesis was if you have a lot of categories, you are going to mark it a lot because otherwise you don't have enough cues to learn how many categories there are and how the systems work. And we did reconstruction with phylogenetic analysis to see how systems change across time. And generally what we find is supporting evidence for the second hypothesis, that you actually have a positive reinforcement between, for example, the number of categories, and the numbers of places where they are marked. So the idea is if you have a lot of categories, you tend to mark them in the adjective, the pronouns, the verb, as many as possible, because like this, in language acquisition, it gives you more cues to learn how the system works. So that's one example of method. The other one is to try to combine it with, let's say, different types of evidence, can be archaeological evidence. For example, the idea here is that when we try to explain why some languages have this system and some don't, we look at, for example, the phylogenetic history of language families, but we also have, that's kind of like a vertical change, but we're also interested in horizontal spread of systems. So like in cases of language contact, you're going to have speakers of a language that use some features of another language that is spoken nearby. And that's also what we're looking at to see how that affects language spread of some features. And to give a final example of what we're working on and going a bit more again in the idea, in the direction of the interaction between grammatical and sociocultural gender, and going more in the direction of French. So there are quite a lot of projects in France, for example, that focus on this interaction. So here I just took one as an example because I work with people from the Institut National de l'Audiovisuel, where they have a project that is called Gender Equality Monitor, where they try to see across time in changes of, for example, TV broadcasts, etc., how are different gender identities represented and how does it change across time. This also relates to a lot of discussion that go in terms of gender equality and how it's reflected in language, and that's one of the focuses of the CNRS. And this relates to the subject of the écriture inclusive, so inclusive writing that has been mentioned. So to people who are not familiar with the idea, so there is one type of movement that says, oh, because we would like to reinforce the representation of, sorry, I'll just jump to the previous slide, to reinforce the distribution of men and women in speech. For example, in French, you would tend to say étudiants et étudiantes, chers toutes et tous, for example. So each time when you have when you say you address people, you mention the feminine and the masculine agreements. This is under debate and for different reasons. So some people say that it makes writing much longer. Some people are against it because it actually reinforces a binary distinction between men and women, while some communities are non-binary, for example. So concretely, when I say dear students feminine and dear students masculine, I'm always emphasizing that there is this difference between women and men, while some communities don't really go in that direction. So another way that has been developed by different communities is what I would call the gender-blind language, so non-genré or hors sexe. The idea here is, so in English, if you want to, let's say, avoid mentioning the gender identity of somebody, you can, I'll just check time if I'm not too much. So you can change the pronoun. So you have he, she, they, or different pronouns for different gender identities. In languages like French, where you have grammatical agreement, changing the pronoun is not sufficient, because if I say, for example, in French, we have il, elle, yel, that is in the dictionary. If I say yel est grande, where, they is tall, let's say, if the adjective tall has a feminine agreement, then it kind of removes the purpose of the pronoun that anonymizes gender. So one solution, some people propose solutions where you change the agreement in French. So the idea is that you propose a third optional agreement pattern where when some people don't want masculine-feminine agreement when they are mentioned, then you can use a third type of agreement. So I just put a table here to give you an idea of here where you have, let's say, different words in French that could have been changed by a system developed by Alferraz, Bord, or an solution by E. Taking the E solution as an example, so if you have, let's say, ideal, idéal, so feminine, idéal, masculine, The E solution would be to change the feminine ending in E, so you get idéalie, nouvelle-i, citoyennerie, activi, etc. So there are a lot of systems that are being developed in relation to development of gender identities and the discussion in that subject. And what I'm interested in is to provide some data and some quantitative testing about this. So I would be really happy if some people around here are interested in doing that together as well. To give an idea of what type of things I'm looking at within this subject. So one question that comes back most of the time is, okay, I have systems like this. So let's say I adopted the one with E. So then it's going to, most people would say, it's going to be super painful to change. I'm going to need to change a lot of words on my website, a lot of words in my documents. That's going to be tough. So before showing some numbers, I'm going to, again, seek your participation in this. So if you were to give a random percentage that comes out of your head, if you have a document, let's say, I don't know, 500-word documents on the website or a job offer or anything, what do you think would be the percentage of words that need to be changed so that the text is gender blind? So to give you an idea, if I have a text of a job offer saying the candidate should have competences in something, in French you would need to change le candidat, you would need to remove the le, the candidat needs to be gender blind, etc. Do we have people who are open to make a guess? I can tell you first, my guess was horribly far away from what I actually measured afterward. So it's totally fine. Yeah? 50? 50%? 50%?
No, 50 words, so 10%.
Oh, 10%. The question is, so let's say if you have a text and we are removing gender marking, you have a French text, and we want to remove all the gender marking that refer to humans. So we don't change anything that relates to objects, but when it talks about humans, like the candidate, we remove the gender marker so that it's gender blind. How many words would need to be changed?
50%.
So 50%, 10%? 2%, 8%, sorry? 10%, 60%, 30%, okay, so I have a huge range. Yeah, 80%?
Probably
One, so we have one who says 99? Okay, so that's concrete. So this shows how diverse it is. To give you a feedback, before I looked at the numbers, I was like, yeah, probably around 30 or 40%. So to give you some ideas, if you take a job offer in French that is posted on the CNRS website, for example, so to give you an idea, the recruitment of an engineer, so the words in bold are those that would need to be changed. Un ingénieur d'études, financed by, so these words would need to be changed. On 700 words in a job offer, you change 11, so it's 1.5%. If you take the Declaration of Droits de l'Homme et du Citoyen, of human and citizen rights of 1789, you change 51 words in 796. So, and most of the words you change are l'homme et le citoyen, because these words are just being repeated entirely within the entire text. If you take, so for events where you're filmed, like this one, sometimes you need to sign a contract saying, oh, I agree to give the rights of image to people. If you take a contract like that, you get 35 words to change on 800, so around 4%. And it's always changing the author, the author, the author, and the cessionnaire, etc. Finally, so this is more a biased example, but I thought it was funny. So if you take a journal article that talks about gender, within 25,000 words, you had hundreds to change. But this, of course, is a biased example because the article is already talking about gender, so authors were most likely aware of that and were trying to pay attention to it. So this is to give you an idea. Of course, it's not exhaustive. So what we are doing is going through large corpora of text, including spoken corpora, to see how frequent are the words that would need to be changed, because this is an actual number that that is directly relevant to the discussion of, okay, do we want to use a gender-blind French? How hard would it be to apply? Another thing is it easy to learn? So if you remember the table that I have shown, there are different systems in E, some people change in X, some people put, I was talking about also systems that can be spoken, because there are some systems that are proposed that are only written, so when you put an at, like in French an arrobase, the one that you use for emails, it's a bit hard to pronounce. But the idea is also to see if you have a system that is spoken, how easy it is to be learned. So what we're doing, for example, is doing experiments online with participants where we tell them, oh, you're exposed to an alien language and you're trying to, we give them examples, we don't explain how it works, and then we see how people can learn it and reproduce sentences afterward to see which system is more easy to learn for participants in general. So if you compare the three that we have shown before, the one that ends in E was apparently, in our experiment, the easiest one to learn, apparently, because it was the most systematic in a way. Again, when we do that, we are not saying that what people should do. We are saying, okay, if you test it this way, this is what you get. Again, afterward, to use it or not, that's really a choice of the community, of the people to do. But at least like this, you have some numbers that can be used by everybody in different ways. And I think I'm going to end here, but just to emphasize again that, so on my side, I mostly work in languages and computational methods, as I have shown, but I would be really interested to develop this thematic, either at a more worldwide scale or specifically for French or other languages that have grammatical gender from a neuroscience approach. So I won't be here all the day, but if you feel like this is my website, this is my email, feel free to drop me some messages if you feel like there are some collaborating things that we could develop. And I'll finish with this slide from a project funded in Lyon where we popularize science through comics. And this is a presentation that the person who made the drawing made about me. So the idea being that we study languages that represented as a Muppet. The Muppet is also supposed to look like me a bit. And but we use different methods, can be computational, and here is a little brain with neuroscience. Yeah. Oh, thanks a lot.